Hello and welcome to the third and final webinar of the Engage2020 project. Today's focus is broadening and deepening mainstreaming engagement. And this is the final webinar that we will have in connection to the Engage2020 project. What we'll be talking about today is engagement in Europe, broadening and deepening engagement, recommendation and support, and then we will finish off with some question and answers, if you have any. So just before we get started, a short introduction to what is Engage2020. Engage2020, who are hosting this webinar, it's a European funded project. It's from FP7. Its aim and the key purpose is enhancing societal engagement in Horizon 2020. And that we have been doing by both mapping what kind of methods are used for engagement, what kind of policies or activities help support public engagement or societal engagement, and also looking at what could be done in the future to support this kind of activities. And please make sure that your microphone is muted, because otherwise there's going to be a lot of background noise. So, so Engage2020 is about enhancing societal engagement in Horizon 2020. And we do this by mapping what is already done, what kind of methods are used, and also what could be done in the future, and also by inspiring new actors to get into engagement and show them how this can be done, where could they start, what is the way forward. And the Engage2020 project is comprised by partners by 6 partners in 5 countries. We have partners in Bulgaria, in Denmark it's the DBT, where I'm from. Then we have 2 partners in Germany, we have the Netherlands, and then we have involved from the UK, and which is also my co-host, which is Edward Anderson. And he will also talk you through some of these findings that we found in the Engage2020 project. So these are some of the activities that we've done, prospects of engagement, more theoretical background. We scanned the praxis, we looked at future perspective, and then we supported societal challenges action, which is we have some support tools that can help you if you want to start with engagement or you want to find inspiration for how to better embed engagement in your institution or in policy activities in your country or in the EU. So, how we view engagement in the Engage2020 project, we focus on engagement not only in the research activities themselves, but we work with 4 levels of public engagement. We look at the policy formation level, which is science policy, but it's also input for policies that influence research and innovation. We look at program development, which is the research programs that fund research and innovation, can give input to what kind of priorities should they focus on. And then there's also the project design level, which is, for example, action research or science shops, where you engage the public in defining what should the research projects be about. And then we also have, of course, engagement at the research activity itself, which is in the collection of data. This could, for example, be citizen science. And in the Engage project, we also work with different types of participants. We have civil society organizations, we have citizens, we have affected people, like consumers, patients, employees, users. So these are different than the regular stakeholders of research and innovation, which are already engage in many ways. So these are not the ones that we've focused on in this project, mainly. So some of the purpose of Engage is to contribute to a scientifically literate society, different perspectives and creativity, more societal relevant research outcomes, and align the needs and wants of society. So this is the RRI, what RRI, Responsible Research and Innovation, wants to contribute to, and Engage 2020 is one of the pillars of, is contributing to RRI through enhancing engagement. Because engagement is one of the foundations of responsible research and innovation. So very quick introduction to Engage 2020. I'll give the word to Edward, who will just say a little bit about engagement in Europe.
Yeah, thank you, Marie-Louise. What we have, so the 3 webinars we have done now, the first one was very much an introduction to engagement, the second one was looking at the future of participative methods, and now we look at this very big question of mainstreaming, institutionalizing, or as we say, broadening and deepening. But I thought it's useful to start by saying, looking at engagement across Europe. And this is a slide that our sister, Mikko Rask, from our sister project, has produced with some of his colleagues. So this is Mikko Rask at the University of Helsinki and the Engage2020 project. This, sorry? And this is based on the MACES report, which came out for quite a number of years ago. So what the map is telling us is how institutionalized is public engagement across Europe. And the redder, the better, really. The hotter the color, the better in terms of the level of institutionalization. And really what we can see, with some exceptions like Ireland, is the further south and the further east you go in Europe, the less institutionalized public engagement is. And there's a variety of reasons for this. But generally speaking, engagement is stronger, more embedded in Northwest Europe than in other parts of Europe. However, if we look at the map, you can also see pluses and minuses, which indicates, well, what's happened since the MACES report? Where have we seen improvements? And I think it's quite telling that in the 5 or so years that the pluses and minuses indicate, there's 23 pluses and 2 minuses. So clearly we are seeing a growth across Europe. There are some parts of Europe where public engagement is much more embedded, where there are institutions that support engagement, where there are laws and regulations, where there's structured training and all the other myriad of ways of supporting it. And there are other areas where there's very little. But we are seeing an overall growth across Europe, and some countries, like Finland, are moving very quickly to catch up. So chances are that this map in 5 years' time will be very different. It will be much redder, it will be much more warm colors, and that some of these countries in Southern and Eastern Europe will be catching up. So this is just a quick snapshot of what does engagement look like across Europe. And bear this in mind, of course, that when we talk about mainstreaming and institutionalization, that will look differently in different countries across Europe. But there are things that need to happen in all countries. So that's the map of Europe, and let's talk a little bit about broadening and deepening, which is the way we've tried to summarize our findings around mainstreaming and institutionalization. And we've mapped over 100 different methods of different approaches to embedding engagement in our policy report. But I want to hand over to Lars Kluver from the Danish Board of Technology, the director of the Danish Board of Technology, to talk a little bit about what we found in our 2.5 years of research in the Engage project.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Edward. Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
You can indeed. That's good. Well, I just want to say welcome as well. As being involved in Engage 2020, it's very nice that people join these webinars to hear about. Yes, I'll say a little about the policies that we have talked about in Engage 2020 and have sketched in our policy briefs, which you can download from the Engage 2020 website. And they basically go over three things you can see here: method development, capacity building, and mainstreaming. With regards to method development, what we basically find is that there's not a very big need for new public engagement, face-to-face public engagement methods. It's not the same as methods would not be developed over time. Here and there will be a special situation and someone will develop something. But we're not in a big lack of methods. There are some areas where we can see that things will develop in the future. Online methods is being discussed a lot. We don't really have the very good methods out there. They have to be developed, but maybe more what's called blended methods, where we use face-to-face processes, but we also use web online services to serve them, to make them work better. That is an area where we see a lot of possible development. When we're talking about another thing was capacity building, where we see. Am I going over what you wanted to say, Edward? Now.
No, it's absolutely fine. I can just jump back to the slides, and you can just give us a quick overview.
Yes, because that was what I would do, and then I think you can deepen out. But because basically capacity building, we see some different areas where there is a big need. For example, having European community begin to talk more about this across Europe. And especially look at those countries where we do not have that much capacity, so also supporting initiatives to make institutions that focus on this is very important. And the third one, mainstreaming engagement. One of the things we have discussed a lot and also write about in our policy briefs is the fact that on the one hand, this is about getting it out there to many countries, but it's also a matter of keeping different levels working with regards to competences. We need to have spearheads in Europe. In the best case, we would have a spearhead or a front runner in each European country, and they would serve the mainstreaming in the future. So one thing that we have discussed, which seems to be very important, is not to think that that mainstreaming is about spreading the butter out on a larger surface, but it's also about having some real quality institutions who can drive this and drive the development and the, you could say, the capacity building that is needed for good mainstreaming. So I think Edward will deepen out some of these points I've mentioned, and I will just mute myself.
Thank you, Lars. I mean, this, I think, is really the crucial area of the work that we've been doing in Engage 2020. Methods are obviously very important, but increasingly, as we do engagement more, we do engagement on a more strategic level, in a deeper way. It becomes very important to think about how this becomes institutionalized, how it becomes mainstreamed, and that's why we talk about broadening and deepening. Broadening in terms of it actually has to spread wider. As the previous map showed, there are parts of Europe where there's very little engagement, and so big challenge in the coming 10 years will be to make sure that engagement happens in geographical areas and in thematic areas like security, where very little has been done. That's the broadening. Then we have the deepening, which I really think comes to the heart of actually making sure that this becomes a more embedded, a more daily, a more natural practice for research and innovation institutions who perhaps haven't done much of this work previously, and where it maybe flies in the face of existing cultures. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we'll go through these areas which Lars has highlighted. The first is obviously around methods. The methods are important, there's no doubt about that. And above all, there are very significant amounts of methods. We did when we developed our action catalog, we found several, we got over 200 responses. We managed to distill those down to the 57 varieties, similar to Heinz. So there's a lot of methods out there, and actually the challenge that we have right now isn't that we need another 57 methods. It's that we need, as Lars said, we need to develop very specialized, very specific methods. We need to work on the online side of things. We need to work on using existing methods in new ways, in new combinations. So it's maybe doing more with the tools we have rather than necessarily going out there and developing new shiny tools. And there's encouraging signs that this is already happening, that we're beginning to use maybe science shops and citizen science together, that the field of user-driven innovation is beginning to work together with deliberation and technology assessment. There's a lot to learn from the different fields, and I think that's been one of the great benefits of European projects. So we talk about blended methods. We talk about that, which means that methods that have been used separately now start to work together and support each other and enhance what they can do. And also, very importantly, we're seeing a growth in the number of projects that apply existing methods which maybe have been around since the 70s or 80s, at a pan-European, across-border level, which I think is really important and something we will very much need as part of Horizon 2020 and beyond. And so as part of that, I thought we would look at one such case of a new cutting-edge, innovative project which goes across boundaries, namely Simulact. And Marie-Louise is much better placed than I am to talk about this, so I'll hand over to her.
Thank you, Edward. Simulact is an example of a big engagement project, applying method or applying engagement into the program formation level, so at the level 2. Simulact is working or using already existing methods, but building on top of that in order to include a new European context, which is we need to include all 28 EU countries, and then we have additional 2 countries. There's also been added some online elements to the already existing methods. There's been added some researcher-citizen interaction. So this is the Simulact project, which started this summer, is an example of the kind of method development that happens that builds on already existing methods and building new elements and into a new context and a new reality. It's also funded by the European Commission. So just a very brief introduction, but Simulact is applying citizen consult workshops in 30 countries to get visions for a sustainable future. They are transforming these visions into research program scenarios where citizens and researchers and different kinds of experts will interact and transform it, and then it will be sent out to a consultation again, and then in the end, and also an online consultation in all 30 countries, and then in the end, there should be some suggestions for new topics for research in all 7 grand challenges. So very brief.
Very brief, but I think this is important to say. So as part of the broadening and mainstreaming, yes, we will need new methodological developments, but the big challenge is to make better use of the tools we already have in the toolbox. So that's what we found when we looked at methods. But of course, methods aren't enough, and we need to start looking broader at capacity, the ability of research institutions and policymakers to actually make use of the tools that we have. Because what has become very clear over the last decade is it's entirely possible to have very good, very effective pilots that don't have wider impact, because the institutions just aren't geared up to take in that new information to process public or societal engagement in the right way. So there's a number of things we've identified. We looked at the issue of support. Now clearly support is needed. Support is needed for scientists and researchers. That's widely acknowledged, but actually we've also identified that there are big support needs, capacity building needs for practitioners who perhaps come from other fields than science and technology and need to understand how to operate in that field, and policymakers. This is a whole institution challenge, a whole system challenge. And so the scientists and researchers need to change how they work. practitioners need to get new skills, and policymakers definitely need to have a change in mindset and a change in skills and capacities. So there will need to be significant training and support there.
And maybe just to add to this, the training for the policymakers is not for them to make necessarily engagement themselves,
yeah.
But if they want to include engagement in research calls, or if they want to support engagement in research and innovation, they need to have a basic idea of where could engagement contribute, because we're not asking to have engagement in everything. You always consider whether engagement is relevant and necessary in a different context. And therefore, the policymakers, they need to know, project officers need to know, when is engagement relevant and when is it needed, and what kind of engagement. So this is the kind of training that could be relevant for policymakers. Absolutely.
We're not expecting policymakers to run their own citizens' juries, but they probably need to be better customers and better commissioners of public engagement. And they need to know what to do with it. I mean, what is the evidence? What can I use this for? I think another area linked to this is, of course, making sure that public engagement becomes part of the curricula. There is an element of a kind of generational shift here, that we need to make sure that the people who come into science and technology get adequate training and support, so this is built into their understanding of their role from the beginning. A useful idea for support could, of course, be pairing schemes, so organizations or countries that are further ahead in thinking about engagement and institutionalizing it could help others. So we think there's a lot of work that needs to happen around support and capacity building, and this is something that the European Commission will play a key role in supporting, providing funding and encouraging. We also think there needs to be more work around collaboration platforms. There are a lot of diverse communities of practice, people working in technology assessment, not necessarily talking to people who work in science shops and the work happening at university level. So there is a key role as well for the European Commission, the key role for national bodies to actually provide platforms for increased collaboration and to provide funding to set these things won't necessarily happen on their own. So I think there is a key role there for funding and support to make that collaboration a reality. And I think the overarching challenge really facing us is to create a pan-European engagement community. At the moment, we have some countries where there are very vibrant engagement communities, but oftentimes these are quite fractured, as I said. And there is a growing recognition that people working in citizen science, people working with user spaces and fab labs, and the people working with deliberative dialogue or technology assessment, we all have we do slightly different things, but there are very clear shared concerns and key issues. And if we want these ways of working to have an impact, then we need to think carefully about how we work together. And I think there's through our conferences, we've seen a lot of people come together who haven't networked previously and beginning to look at, well, how can we work together and how can we develop a common shared community? So that's something I think we will need to see in the coming decade, and we can already see positive signs of it happening. So next, so there's options around this. So obviously, training. We can see that there is this key lack of knowledge and competency out there, and so training is an obvious thing to support. Making it mandatory, setting up support not just for the staff directly involved in the research, but administrative staff, including curricula, service learning, making experiential learning which brings people into direct contact with citizens, very valuable. But also, let's not forget that civil society organizations, citizens will need support and training to make this a reality. And we've got a list of resources here which I think could be very useful for people. Obviously our project Engage2020 has a tremendous amount of resources, P2020, RRI tools, Participation Compass, Living Knowledge Network. All of these are very valuable places to go for more information if you need it. If you have questions about what we're talking about here, please do write them in the chat box, and we will take them at the end. An infrastructure example is the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, a UK-based centre for embedding engagement at universities, changing the culture of how universities and academic institutions function. So this was originally funded as part of the Beacons for Public Engagement, which was a 2008 funding program, but it's lived on beyond that support program and now provides advice and support to universities across the UK. And I think this is an interesting case where, as Lars said, mainstreaming doesn't mean we stop needing spearheads. And so clearly the spearhead here, this is an example of an organization which plays this key role in bringing people together. So it's a good example. They've got lots of resources on their website. They provide training, advice, networking, and I think we'll need to see more of these infrastructure organizations built up across Europe, and indeed we'll probably need to see pan-European ones. And maybe that's a separate organization, and maybe it's an organization which functions, or maybe it's more of a network. So that's a little bit about the capacity building side. And then the third area that Lars mentioned was around mainstreaming. And mainstreaming as a word, in some countries it has quite a negative connotation. It means to be boring and drab and not exciting. But actually I think we do need to see engagement going from this interesting work that we do in pilots and small units into something which begins to permeate across the organization and becomes daily practice, just how things are done. And obviously part of this is the institutions, the infrastructure, setting up expert resource centers, building frameworks. It also has a lot to do with funding and incentives. That something holding engagement back is that engagement isn't something which is widely celebrated and promoted and supported as part of an academic career. It's often something that academics do despite the way that career incentives are. It's something that can harm or certainly doesn't support the benefit their career, and that needs to change. And there's certainly work around communication and promotion, awards, advice schemes, etc. And of course, let's not also forget the legal and institutional frameworks that exist. Setting up codes of conduct, setting up other frameworks can also be really important in sending out strong signals about what we value in research and innovation. So I think rules and regulations, they obviously have their limits. The UK has instituted a number of rules. They can become formulaic and a tick box exercise, but they also send out a good, strong signal about what it is that is expected of research innovation institutions. So the options we've looked at include rules, legislation for making PE part of science and technology policymaking, rules which require CSOs to be involved in how research money is spent, codes of conduct for public engagement in universities. These are all important things to consider, and indeed our policy report includes them in much more detail. We also think it's really important to look at the ways that infrastructures, institutions, and networks could be set up to support this. Because at the moment there is a lack of capacity. There's people who want to do engagement, don't know where to turn. And so creating EU level or national platforms for public engagement will be important, as well as setting up civil society councils, which allow civil society organizations to network. And I think that the funding institutions will play a key role, that if research councils and funders want to see engagement, they will have to invest money in skilling up the people who will be applying for awards. And then, of course, we have science shops and other expert centers that act as an interface between the research community and CSOs and citizens. They've been around a long time, and we'll need to see the continued development of those kinds of structures. So these are all also important. And of course, ultimately, a big part of mainstreaming will be money. It is about incentives and making sure that it's actually worthwhile engaging for a researcher or a policymaker. So there are different things. We can already see today that public engagement is becoming a part of a lot of bids in Horizon 2020, but maybe there needs to be a percentage reserved for this, providing fast funding routes for public engagement, which can often be needed at quite short notice because of developments, making it mandatory in certain calls, including competencies around public engagement in the recruitment of staff, and making sure that there is funding for this type of participative research at university level. So we think that it is important that this is something which is valuable and supported. And then, of course, we need to promote it. We need to have awards. We need to have other ways of celebrating success. And we need to evaluate it. It's an emerging field. It's an experimental field. And therefore, we need to be able to distinguish between the practice that works and the practice that doesn't. So there's a broad range of options, as you can see. Some options which are relevant to universities, some for EU levels. But if we want to see this map of Europe shift from cold colors to warmer colors, we will need to see these policies applied more broadly across Europe. And an example here, I'm not going to go into too much detail, is the Code of Conduct for Responsible Nanotechnologies, which the European Commission facilitated the creation of. And it's an interesting example of a policy document which really sets out that an expectation that responsible research and innovation on nanotechnology will include the participation of the relevant stakeholders. And these kind of documents can be very important in shifting culture. That's ultimately what we're talking about here. It's actually changing cultures. And cultures are notoriously difficult to shift, which is why we need this broad range of interventions to make a difference. So that's a little bit about the findings, what we found when we looked at things. Anything to add, Marie-Louise, at this stage?
No, I mean, this is focusing on the policy recommendation and activities that could help support, which could help mainstreaming and deepening engagement. And I think this is our key findings, and you will, I think, also just sum up on that. And then we will also tell you a little bit about the more practical support tools we have for broadening and deepening. So people who actually want to get engaged with engagement, we have some support tools for that as well.
So those of you who are sort of sitting there saying, well, how do I do it? How do I actually go about this? Don't worry, we'll give you some practical tools as well. So to sum up, I mean, at the moment, it's actually quite a positive picture. The map I showed you shows that we have many more pluses than minuses, where many countries are moving in the right direction. And we are seeing increasingly more and more engagement. We're seeing earlier engagement of citizens. We're seeing more and more countries that are developing and fields that are developing suitable environments for engagement. This includes countries, but it also includes academic disciplines. So even in areas like security, which had previously been quite secluded, we're seeing the first projects coming in which involve stakeholders and citizens. We're seeing increasing focus on funding and incentives. We're seeing more sophisticated work around monitoring and evaluation, and a growing new culture of engagement amongst academics and amongst some policymakers. So there are good elements to be found, but we still have a lot of way to go. And I think it's worth mentioning that the European Commission and the community has taken significant steps and has been very important in spreading engagement also to the eastern and southern parts of Europe, where very little has happened. It's also encouraging to see the continuation of long players, the kind of institutions that have been around since the 70s or 80s in some case, in terms of science shops, in terms of technology assessment, continuing, as well as this kind of vivid development of citizen science and other fields, and how these two can begin to start to interact in interesting and exciting ways. So that's, I think, really important to acknowledge. We've come a long way, but a lot still needs to happen. So clearly we still need to create formal rules. We need to create a structure which allows public engagement to happen in a way which is conducive to feeding into policy and making a real difference. There needs to be much more focus on infrastructure. This kind of work can be done as individual pilot exercises, but it loses a lot of its impact. It needs to have an ongoing support for it to work. It needs to be funded, it needs to be incentivized, and clearly people need to be trained. This is not something that researchers have been recruited to do. It's not something that they've been trained to do. And to expect them to go out and do it without any support is naive. So this needs to happen. And of course, we also need to be realistic that certain countries starting from a low baseline will need to set their sights at a realistic level. And I think it's going to be an exciting few years ahead, because a lot has happened and a lot will happen given the focus. And now we'll shift and talk about the support that Engage2020 can provide you around mainstreaming, and around understanding and capacity building, and the support that others could as well. And I think a first interesting tool is the Action Catalogue, which is an online toolkit which allows people to explore methods of engagement based on what those methods can do rather than their names. And we developed the Action Catalogue using a very detailed, sophisticated approach. We went out with a questionnaire. We had 200 responses about different forms of engagement. We went through these, sifted through them, identified 57 categories that were significant and specific enough that they warranted inclusion as separate methods. We then looked at what are the key questions that someone who's new to engagement will have around a method, and we developed criteria for those that we then matched and assessed the methods. So how much IT knowledge do you need to run this method? How much budget do you need? How many participants can you reach? And what are the realistic benefits and outcomes that you can get from this method? So we matched and assessed each method based on those questions. And then we filled in a fact sheet which was peer-reviewed by members of the consortium and uploaded to an interactive platform. And I think we have we can look at the platform if we, yeah, we can do that. So Marie-Louise is going to pull up the platform. I think that the project, the platform is really interesting because it doesn't work with a kind of very dualistic, simplistic, binary notion of how methods work, because methods don't work. It's not like there's yes or no always. Sometimes there is a case where you want to. So what Marie-Louise is showing you here is that you have the 57 methods, and once you click policy formation, that's the level I want to work at. They change size based on whether or not they're suitable for that. And if we also want to do dialogue, for example, once again, they change size. So it's not removing methods and saying you should never use them. It's just giving you a sense, by visually making them bigger or smaller, how suitable they are. This is a real-time development. If we then click on citizens hearing here, which is one of those methods which it came up as suitable for what we selected, you get a description. You get a lot of detail about what the method is, where it's come from, what it can do, who it's suitable for, when it's unsuitable, who can run it, what levels it's been used at, as well as weaknesses, strengths, links to other case studies, lots of very useful information about these different approaches. So I would really recommend you accessing the Action Catalogue, making use of it, because it's a useful way of actually getting to grips with the very complex area of public participation. We tend to start with public engagement where what we know, which is why we have these silos or these communities of practice that don't interact. So this can be an interesting way to find out, if you work in science shops, to find out a little bit more about user involvement or vice versa, for example. So yeah, I think it's really worth looking at these methods. and using the action catalog as something that you as something to work with. So that's the action catalog. We also have an E-Anthology, which is a PDF or an ebook, which it's essentially the entry point into the Engage 2020 project. We've worked for over 2 years. We've developed a number of very intricate, detailed policy reports, which, as all intricate and detailed policy reports, has the downside of being quite long. So the E-Anthology is a document which is specifically made for you to be able to browse on your phone or your tablet or your computer, and to quickly access various parts of the project's information, interesting updates from thinking from various people about why engagement is important, and has a lot of links to other resources.
But not just about policy, it's also about how to do engagement. Where do you start? What are the good examples? Where can you find more information and this kind? So it's both focusing on what is engagement, why do you do it, and how do you do it?
Yeah.
And then we have the policy briefs that sum up all our policy recommendations.
Yes. So if we look further afield, there's lots of stuff from the Engage website. We're going to really recommend you go and look at them. We have reports about methods of engagement, detailed things about the policies. I mean, everything we've talked about policy options, this is only scraping the surface of the detailed information we have available in our report. So if this was useful for you, please go and check that out. We have reports about the future of policy, the future of methods. All of these are available on our website, as well as the policy briefs that Marie-Louise mentioned. And the policy briefs are actually a very good way for you to find out whether or not a full-length report is going to be interesting for you or not. So look at the action catalog, look at the E-Anthology, have a look at the policy briefs, and the policy briefs will then give you an indication of which of the full-length reports you might want to look at. And we're very keen on making sure that these tools are widely used by practitioners, by policymakers, by researchers. So by all means, share them with your colleagues. And you can find all of this and more at the Engage2020.eu website. So that's a little bit about the Engage project, about our policy options. A lot has happened, a lot has been really, it's been very encouraging to see, but we've still got a long way to go. And at this stage, I welcome questions. So if you have questions for us, then by all means send us send a message in the chat box. Happy to answer any questions related to policy or the methods or the support structures we set up. And I know that we also have some other consortium members on the call, and they might also be interested in contributing some thoughts. So if you do, by all means send a message. Now, as I said, it's been one of the great things about this project has been to see the breadth of interventions that have been happening across Europe. As someone who's been based in the UK and sometimes quite narrowly focusing on what's happening there, it's been very gratifying to see how much and how diverse interventions have been done across Europe.
Okay, it doesn't seem like there's any additional questions.
Oh, hang on. No, we have a very long question. See, I never give up hope. There's always a good question. So we have a question here from Hermione. In Greece, public engagement is still very low, as well as public participation in decision making. One of the main difficulties in engaging society is that people feel that it doesn't make any sense. The results of pilot projects implemented were ignored in the majority of cases. And when we declare it's an EU priority too, an argument we often hear is that even the EU doesn't take into account the results of such processes, such as Right to Water Citizens Initiative or Against TIP Citizens Initiative. Although these initiatives are clearly not engagement processes in RRI, they do engage citizens in a way. Have you encountered such arguments in on the EU role and policy? And if yes, how do you deal with it?
I think there are several answers to this, but I think one of the things that we also discussed and which we also took up on the conference we had in Brussels earlier this month was that there's a lot of the research happening that has engagement that focus on EU policies, but they're not connected to the policy formation in these areas, and that's one of the recommendations that we gave to the EU, that they should deal with this to a great extent. Another thing is that it's always important when doing engagement to make sure that you have aligned the expectations for what is it that you can actually promise, because when it comes to making engagement in connection to policy, we can never, in most processes, we cannot promise that it will be taken, that it will affect the decision, but what we can promise is that we will make sure to make them listen to the results of the engagement and do our best for them to include it in that. I'm not really sure if we can go much further than that.
But I guess I would say that this is one of the big challenges. It's that even successful projects haven't always been good at feeding back to participants. And a big part of this is, of course, engendering this trust and continued engagement. And why would citizens get involved again if they don't feel like it's made a difference? So, yes, I think as part of this wider culture change, we need to stop looking at public engagement as one-off events and as something where we need to have a continuing communication with people and make sure that we invest the resources in feeding back. So I think that it's a vital part of it. And as well, I think an important role for this emerging community of practice at the EU level is to call people out. When we see badly run processes or policymakers embracing engagement simply to look good, I mean, that's very detrimental to engagement as a whole. And having a wider community helps us to have awards and celebrate good practice, but also to react to bad practice and stop people doing things. And that's where code of conducts can be really useful.
Okay. We'll just hand over the word to Lars as well.
Yeah.
I just want to add to what has been said that already in the middle of the 90s, there was a big project called Eruptor where we looked into many participatory processes and looked especially into the reason why people had felt that they maybe failed, and that touched exactly on this thing, that they were too unconnected to the policy area that they wanted to deal with and also have influence on. And I think since then, my feeling is that one of the things which is very important when dealing with public participation, but I basically think with anything that makes results, is not to start with the planning of the participation, but the first thing you do is actually to plan your follow-up. So basically, when you make your participation, you already know how you will follow up, and you already had a strategy. So all around making the participation, you are continuously thinking of strengthening that strategy so that you're ready when you have the results. Too many people simply make a participation and then afterwards they begin to try to make it impact, to give it impact. It should be the other way around. Define how you want to make impact and then begin to make participation. I think that's very important.
Thank you, Lars. That's also one of the experience we had from the PACISA project, where we did a European consultation with the citizen summits in 11 countries on sustainable consumption. From the beginning of planning the consultation, we engaged in meetings with policymakers, researchers, and different kinds of stakeholders, and especially with the policymakers at the European level. What kind of topics were coming up, what kind of issues were they dealing with, where they could be interested in getting the perspective of citizens. So it's a very good idea to think from the beginning, who is it that we want to deliver these results to, and also what kind of results is it that they are interested in, so that you make sure that the focus of your consultation also is relevant for where the policy making is going.
Yeah, and I think we've perhaps had a system in the past where practitioners have perhaps been sometimes a little bit naive that, we do a good process and then policymakers should listen to it. It's kind of a moral imperative. This is the voice of the citizens. But we need to make sure that it fits time-wise and topic-wise, and that I think generally the fewer steps you place between the decision maker and the participation process, the more impact it can have. So I think Lars and Marie-Louise are absolutely right. Let's build it in from the beginning.
And we just have Emma McKenna from the Enrich project are asking for if you have any good knowledge or good examples of how RRI or good practice for RRI has been built in through the curriculum. Curriculum.
Yes.
Then please get in contact with her because she would like to have some very good examples of how this is done.
Let's post the link to the chat room. And if you have examples or projects that you'd like to promote or toolkits, just post them in the chat, but make sure you send it to everyone, because then we're able to support that growing community, which I think is so important. So that's the Enrich project with 2 R's, and hopefully you'll see it now in the chat function. We also had a question or comment, a question from Louis Barbarino, that there seems to be a focus on tools for talking about engagement, not really tools to be doing engagement in everyday practice. It seems more about communication of results than engagement with processes through collaborating tools. So do you know of examples of groups using collaborative platforms besides the citizen science ones to really produce work together at a local scale, not just communicate it? So I think that's a really valuable point. Now, obviously, this webinar is largely about policy. We had a webinar yesterday which was more about the methodology side of things. So a lot of the focus in today's webinar has been around the communication and the stuff that happens around the engagement to make it more effective. In terms of the kind of collaborative platforms, what I thought was very interesting in the conference we did in Brussels was the fact that the citizen science platforms like Zooniverse are now implementing a next step, which is allowing people to create their own projects. So what started out as a space where citizens had a very limited data analysis role, data collection role perhaps, is now becoming more open and more fluid. So I think it would be very interesting to think about, well, could we take these collaborative platforms which have shown their worth in citizen science, and where else can we use them? I'm not suggesting, of course, that we cannot replace deliberative face-to-face engagement with online engagement, but I think that they can support each other.
But I think one of the comments that I understand, Louis, correctly, is that there's a lot of focus on communicating engagement. And what we try to do with Action Catalogue is to give tools for making the actual engagement, because there's a lot of focus on communication of engagement, but if you don't have a good engagement process itself, then you don't have the quality that allows you to, that should allow you to communicate it as wisely.
Yeah.
Also. And
so there's a comment from.
Yes. Can we bit more?
Yeah. Can we? So there's.
So there's also a question from John Coops. Do you prefer to speak it yourself or to?
Yeah. Let's unmute John and see if John, if you're able to talk. Do you want to ask your question, John?
Okay, otherwise we'll
yep. So John says, I'm participating in the session from Canada. The issues you're dealing with in public engagement are common both in Europe and North America. Are there parallel efforts such as yours taking part in North America? And if so, what organization is the spearhead? That's a really good question. I think we've focused very much on Europe whilst drawing in international examples. So I'm not sure we're necessarily the best placed, but I can certainly say that when it comes to engagement, perhaps not just in science and technology, there certainly seem to be networks and organizations like the Deliberative Democracy Consortium, like the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, who are filling creating the community function. I don't know, Marie-Louise, if you have additional thoughts?
I'm not sure if there's anything exactly like Engage2020 or something, but I know, and probably Henk will be able to support that, but there has been, collaboration between North America and in the science shop, as far as I've understood. But otherwise, the engagement channels that we have mostly contact with in the US or in North America and Canada, that has mostly been on engagement more broadly in policy making and local community building, and not so much in research and innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Alberta Climate Dialogue is an interesting one as well. But I think Henk has posted a few helpful resources here, and this is the great thing about the webinars, is that you get lots of these links popping up. Henk, do you want to say anything about these networks and where people can find support internationally?
Yeah, well, the first link I sent was for the Community Campus Partnerships for Health. That's a US-based organization specifically for research in health issues, but they take health quite broadly, so including social equality. The other link is for Community Research Canada, which is like an umbrella organization encompassing like science shops and people doing community-based research, participatory action research, and a lot. And one of their partners is the UNESCO Chair for Social Responsibility in Higher Education and Community-Based Research. And they have a strong international link as well with India and other southern countries. So these are the two largest organizations that I'm aware of, and they can probably point you to specific organizations that more or less are in your own field. So I know there's people specializing in ethics of community-based research, and there's some doing social sciences research or First Nations with First Nations people, and but these are the two main networks that I'm aware of.
Great. So usually when you start to look, there is a lot of stuff happening, but not necessarily joined up. So there's a question about whether or not there will be additional webinars on Engage in new project development process. I'm afraid there is no more webinars from Engage2020 because the project is drawing to a close. However, I know that our sister project, Public Engagement 2020, will be continuing to do work, and it's possible that they will be doing some webinars. And actually, what's really interesting to see is we have a lot of projects happening at the EU level right now with regards to RRI tools, Simulact, and while I can't say if they're doing webinars, I certainly know that there will be a lot of activity happening.
But there are a couple of other projects focusing on engagement, which still runs for a couple of years, so that could be an option. And I think you should be able to see most of them through the the P2020 website connects, and also the RRI tools I think also connects. And there are several projects that focus on this. I'm not sure if they have one on new product development, but that's definitely worth taking with us for.
Well, why? I mean, also talk to them. If you have a particular webinar that you're keen to see, I obviously can't speak for other projects, but I know that when we've been working at Engage, we've been very happy to get thoughts and ideas about what is the particular topic that is most interesting to you. So I think that's also very important. So I think we've taken up the time that we said we'd do. So, Louise, do you want to ask your question yourself, perhaps? So we don't have to read it for you. I'll unmute you and see if you have a Louise.
Hi.
Hi. Excellent. We can hear you. So do you want to share your thoughts? Share your thoughts.
Yes, I'm always wondering about how things get done in actual practice, and I think the catalog is amazing. The action catalog is amazing. How you use multiple decision to get in choosing what you can do with the different methods. But then, how do you transfer from, well, I've chosen this or that method, and how do I start doing it? So you have to collaborate with your team. You have to get examples or whatever. So I was giving there an example that what if the action method had this kind of management or collaborative platform attached to it? So you have the methods, and then you can collaborate with others by putting more examples there. So more of a dynamic thing. Just a quick notebook on with one page of the action catalog, and I think it might work as a way of getting things done. Because I've tried this with other trainings and all that, and putting things in a collaborative platform makes easier to getting things done. So just you could have a look and see how it might be interesting.
Thank you. No, I think it would be good to think. We need to think more creatively about our toolkits, and you know, obviously the visual thing with the it's an important part of it. But I agree that a dynamic community of practitioners who can share examples is clearly very important. So thank you for. Do you want? I mean, do you want to? Yeah, I think that's really good. Thank you.
You can share it to the group if you want to.
Okay. Well, if you wanted to just post it to the chat using just making sure that it's listed to everyone, because I think it's useful to see this.
Yeah. Hayden will just write. Well, he writes to everyone. There's a knowledge sharing platform project probably starting up soon because there has been a call for it. So they are in the middle of evaluating. So in the beginning of 2016, probably a new project will start with such a collaborative platform. But I think with this in mind, I think we've come to
we've come to the end of the hour, and of course, as always, we can continue to talk about these issues for a very long time. But I think that we thank you for your time, thank you for your enthusiasm, and in closing, clearly we have a very long list of things to do. But let's not forget that we've also ticked off a lot of things on the to-do list. Going back to that map that we had earlier on, which showed that yes, half of Europe is still quite cold in color, half of Europe still has a lot to do, and of course even the countries that are bright red, those of you who work in them know that there's a lot of, culture hasn't changed completely, there's a lot of frustrations with this way of working, and sometimes it feels like rolling that boulder up the hill only to see it roll down again. But actually, across Europe, we're seeing a lot of pluses. We're seeing a lot of developments. I think that the coming years of Horizon 2020 and beyond will be full of interesting developments. So Engage2020 has been part of creating this new community, and there are new projects now which will continue that journey. And even though the Danish Board of Technology and Involve won't be working on Engage2020 anymore, we do look forward to working with you all in this ongoing work around mainstreaming and embedding public engagement across Europe in the years to come.
Yeah, and please don't hesitate to contact any of the Engage2020 partners if you want to discuss anything or want to drop off ideas or similar. I mean,
yeah. And we're
still going to be working with engagement, so
yeah, we're not giving up on this. And we are going to be posting the slides and probably also a recording of the webinars on the web address. So feel free to share those with colleagues who weren't able to take part. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you for participating.